Yeah.
So can we talk about Heidegger?
Okay.
Who is this philosopher? What are some fascinating ideas that he brought to the world?
Okay, so Martin Heidegger was a German philosopher. I do know when he was born, 1889. I know that only by accident. It's because it's the same year that Wittgenstein, an Austrian philosopher, was born, and the same year that Hitler was born. So if I've remembered my dates right, and someone will call in and correct me otherwise. But that's the way it sort of sits in my memory bank. And it's interesting that the three of them were born at the same time. Wittgenstein and Heidegger share some similarities, but then it's also interesting that Heidegger was a Nazi. I mean, this is a very disturbing fact about his personal political background. And so it's something that anyone who thinks that things that he said might be interesting has got to contend for.
Heidegger was born in Germany, Hitler in Austria, Wittgenstein is Austria also. But so you have to, when you call Heidegger a Nazi, you have to remember, I mean, there was millions of Nazis too. So like there are parts of that's the history of the world. There's a lot of communists, Marxists, and Nazis in that part of history.
Absolutely. And, one of the discussion points is, well, was he just a kind of social Nazi? I mean, he went to parties with them and stuff, or was he like, did he really believe in the ideology? Yeah. And that's a choice point. And we could talk about it if you want. He held a political position. That's one of the relevant parts. In 1933, he was made rector of the University of Freiburg. That's like the president of the university. And that was in Germany. All the universities are state universities, and so that's a political appointment.
Can we just pause on this point?
Yeah.
From an existentialist perspective, what's the role for standing up to evil? So, I mean, I think Camus probably had something to say about these things because he was a bit of a political figure. Like, do you have a responsibility not just for your decisions, but if the world you see around you is going against what you believe somewhere deep inside is ethical, do you have a responsibility to stand up to that, even if it costs you your life or your well-being?
You ask from an existential perspective, and there's lots of different positions that you could have. So let me tell you something in the area of what I think I might believe, which comes out of this tradition. And it's this: if you live in a community where people are being dragged down by the norms of the community rather than elevated, then there's two things that you have to recognize. One is that you bear some responsibility for that. Not necessarily because you chose it. Maybe you reviled it. Maybe you were against it. But there's some way in which we all act in accordance with the norms of our culture. We all give in to them in some way or another. And if those norms are broken, then there's some way in which we've allowed ourselves to be responsible for broken norms. We've become responsible for broken norms. And I do think you have to face up to that. I think that, let's just take gender norms. Maybe the gender norms are broken. Maybe the way men and women treat one another or the way men treat women is broken. Maybe it is. Maybe there's, I'm not making a substantive claim. I'm just saying, lots of people say it is. And if you're in a culture where those norms take root, you don't get to just isolate yourself and pull yourself out of the culture and think, I don't have any responsibility. That you're already a part of the culture, even if you're isolating yourself from it. That's a way of rejecting the sort of part you play in the culture, but it's not a way of getting behind it. Now you're playing that role differently. You're saying, I don't want to take responsibility for what's going on around me. And that's a way of taking responsibility by refusing to do it. So I think we're implicated in whatever's going on around us. And if we're going to do anything in our lives, we ought to recognize that, recognize that even in situations where you maybe didn't decide to do it, you could be part of bringing other people down. And then devote yourself to trying to figure out how to act differently so that the norms update themselves. And I think this is not a criticism of people. The Alyosha, who we mentioned in the Brothers Karamazov, he's a character. He's a kind of saintly character in the Brothers Karamazov. But that one crucial moment in that story is when he realizes how awful he's been being to someone without ever even intending to do that. Mm-hmm. It's Grushenka, who's this sort of fascinating woman, and she's a very erotic woman. She's sort of sexual, and Alyosha, in my reading of it, is kind of attracted to her. Mm-hmm. But he's a young kid. He's 20 or whatever, and he's kind of embarrassed about it. And he lives in the monastery, and he's thinking maybe he wants to be a priest, and he's kind of embarrassed by it. So what does he do? Every time they run across one another in the street, he averts his gaze. And why is he doing that? Because he's kind of embarrassed. You know? But how does Grushenka experience it? Well, she knows she's a fallen woman, and she knows that Alyosha has this other position in society. Mm-hmm. So her read on it is, he's passing judgment on me. He can see that he doesn't want to be associated with me. Mm-hmm. He can see that I'm a fallen woman. He knows that in order to maintain his purity, he's got to avoid me. That's not what Alyosha intended to do, but that's the way it's experienced. And so there's this way he comes to recognize, oh my God, like what I'm supposed to do is love people, mm-hmm. in Dostoevsky's view of things. And what I'm doing instead is dragging this poor woman down. I'm making her life worse. I'm making her feel terrible about herself. And if I actually came to know her, I'd recognize her condition is difficult. Mm-hmm. She's living a difficult life. She's making hard choices. And why don't I see that in her face instead of this other thing that's making me want to avoid her? And that's a huge moment. So the idea is that we're implicated in bringing mm-hmm. other people down, whether we want to be or not. And that's our condition. So
the requirement to understand that is to be almost to a radical degree, be empathetic and to listen to the world. And I mean, you brought up sort of gender roles. It's not so simple. All of this is messy. For example, this is me talking. It's clear to me that, for example, the woke culture has bullying built into it, has some elements of the same kind of evil built into it. And when you're part of the wave of wokeness, standing up for social rights, you also have to listen and think, are we going too far? Are we hurting people? Are we doing the same things that we're fighting against, that others were doing in the past? So it's not simple once you see that there's evil